Today we'll be looking at the oppression of women, and if there is any, and in which aspects of life this occurs. I can already hear some of you screaming, "But Wutu, you're a straight white man. You are very biased and don't have the same experience of that of a woman." And to that I say, although you may see me as the demon lord, maybe Lucifer himself, it is just that. It is anecdotal evidence that brings with it the least amount of scientific credibility. Since we tend to focus on higher levels of scientific credibility on this channel, the phenomena and statistics that I'll be presenting in this video should still be regarded as with any other person. Also, neglecting my ideas simply because I'm a man is discrimination and sexist. I have to add that I'm only talking about the Western world in this video, and even within the Western world there are a great many differences. This is an analysis based on research I've read and I assume is factual, but even the conclusion I will draw in this video should still not be regarded as 100% factual. Hard questions such as this one are even harder to answer completely, but I'll do my best in this video. Regard this video as an indication of the truth, but not the truth itself. I think it's important to lay down the groundworks on how oppression may take place in multiple forms, namely stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotyping is assigning a set of qualities or characteristics to a group. Prejudice is the forming of an opinion of these groups based on the characterization or qualities that you've formed about this group. Discrimination is actually taking action based on these opinions that you formed about the characteristics or qualities you've assigned to a group. I personally would argue that if there's no discrimination in place, there's no oppression, since you have to take action. My definition of oppression would be prolonged discrimination exercised by an authority, since were it not prolonged, it would just be discrimination. And were it exercised with someone with equal power, it would also just be discrimination. I think it is also important to mention the logical fallacy that is inherent in discrimination. When you base your actions off of what you think a group is like, you ignore the individuality of responsibility. So, what one person did, one person is responsible for. What a group did, a group is responsible for, and not the individual, and vice versa. But to point out the obvious, oppression is still too strong of a word to use. Why? Well, let's look at some synonyms of oppression to illustrate what it really means besides this definition. Persecution, tyranny, abuse, enslavement, or despotism. Well, I think we can all agree that this is not something that women go through on a daily basis. We'll be calling oppression disadvantage from now on, since it's more fitting of a word. I know, but disadvantaged sounds less of a catchy title to use, so. Disadvantaged is still fitting the description, since being structurally disadvantaged still requires prolonged discrimination exercised by an authority. Requiring authority is debatable, fair, but it's my video, so we'll run with it. So, what aspects of life can oppression take place in? Well, according to ChatGPT, it can take place in social, cultural, economic, political, legal and judicial, educational, healthcare, media and communication, environmental, interpersonal and familial, institutional and systemic. These are 10 places, and I'll elaborate each one on the basis of what ChatGPT has provided me on extra information or just whatever extra interpretations I gave them. I'll try to answer every single aspect as solidly as possible and give a conclusion at the end of each one. I'll also give the advantage or oppression every time I rank, with A, where women are advantaged, N, where women are neutral, so it's even between men and women, or D, where women are disadvantaged in that aspect of life. So, to start off, social and cultural. What does this mean? This is probably the vaguest of the bunch, and I think women feel the most disadvantaged in. This is discrimination based on gender or exclusion from societal norms, traditions, or customs. I would honestly say that I can't really put... Oh, you're back, man. I would honestly say that in my eyes, I can't really put a finger on such a non-data driven or subjective aspect of life. Good sake. So, we're on a holiday right now, and it's pretty hot. So, my camera got overheated, or well, my spare telephone. But it's okay, because we're back now, but the angle might have changed. I will answer this one based on the average of all the other categories. If you don't like this, that is fair, but the West has such a great deal of cultural diversity and differences in societal structures that I'm just not qualified to speak on this. I do, however, think that averaging the other categories is fair, because basically every other interaction stems from societal and cultural norms. And like the Bible said, judge a tree by the fruit it bears. So, moving on to the economic aspect. This category entails the unequal distribution of wealth, resources, opportunity, education, or wealth distribution. This also includes the wage gap. So, let's dissect this step for step. The most famous economic unfairness between men and women is the gender pay gap. I could not find conclusive evidence that the gender pay gap is a result of systemic disadvantages against women. The evidence alludes more so to a gender earnings gap. In the UK, that being 70%, in the Netherlands, that being about 6 to 19%, and in the US, that being from about 22 to 30%. In a report done by Tracy Anderson et al., they revealed that there are some other variables at play here. The ones they've measured and account for a section or a percentage of the gender pay gap are part-time working, traveling patterns, occupational segregation, and workplace segregation. Quantifying the role of discrimination has not been possible so far. This report has been done in 2001, and I can imagine that emancipation has not been lessened in that time frame. The pay gap is about the same as it was 20 years ago in the US. This is just one study that goes about explaining the wage gap to be more of an earnings gap, but I've linked in the reference list an article that goes about disproving this whole idea. I digress. Are there unequal job opportunities? This is a hard one because no organization is really itching to provide some data that could prove they're potentially structurally discriminating. It is true that men generally have a temperament that increases the chances of them actively seeking promotions or just generally doing more well in a business landscape, being more disagreeable, less neurotic, and more aggressive. These are all qualities that are essential for a cutthroat environment such as a business landscape, and people that hire know that. It is also true that people generally choose people for promotions from their own personal network, and that through biases mostly consist of people like them. In a traditional male work environment, this could take a couple generations for this to adjust. So, this begs the question, is it disadvantageous for women to not be selected for positions based on implicit biases? I would say intuitively yes, but based on the definition, it is arguable. I'll say for the sake of argument that this is slightly disadvantageous, but in order to put the whole category as structurally disadvantaged against women, we'll need more evidence of discrimination. So, how does education fare? More women have been in higher education than men for the past 23 years. I think that this giant shift in education is not yet apparent because famous intellectuals or heads of companies are generally pretty old, and this development is pretty recent. I'll predict we'll see many more public intellectuals that are women in the upcoming decades. Another interesting development is that in egalitarian societies such as in Scandinavia or the Netherlands to a lesser, people tend to choose more sex stereotypical jobs, and this shows a clear predisposition for certain jobs for men and women in the absence of societal pressures. I would like to add that people who choose a field that is predominantly occupied by the other sex are more likely to face bias against them. In conclusion, instead of there being a pay gap but an earnings gap, an arguably slight disadvantage in job opportunities, and an advantage in the education levels, I would personally say that women are not disadvantaged in the economic sector. We will put this as neutral. On to the political aspect. Is there a lack of representation or participation in the decision-making process that could lead to disadvantages against women? Are we suppressing women's voices and censoring them? Well, since we're only talking about the West, the average of the number of females in the parliament is about 38%. But since I really didn't feel like weighing the average, this could change with about 3%. This is just based on my feelings for numbers, which is honestly not bad. This is an underrepresentation compared to the egalitarian societies, such as in Scandinavia, where the participation of women in the parliament is about 45%. So I assume this is what every country would have been when they were an egalitarian society. Funnily enough, the amount of ministers in the West is very widespread, from about 33% in the US to about 64% in Finland. Most European countries, with the exception of France and the UK, employ for their ministers about 50% or higher as women. So, is this unequal? Well, depending where you live, yes. So, we've established there's a discrepancy. Is this discrimination? That would mean that women are actively hindered in their political careers by authorities. According to an EU briefing, there are a couple of obstacles women face when dealing in their political careers. There are barriers that block the supply of women into politics, such as unequal access to resources, gender roles and stereotypes, and there being no female role models. There are also barriers that block the demand of women in politics, namely the recruiting process of various parties and how they choose their champion candidates. I would call what is presented here as discrimination. Since it's prolonged and discriminatory, we should call this disadvantaged. We'll put a D here. Now, let's do legal and judicial. Are there any discriminatory laws against the sex? Biased law enforcement? Well, legally, men and women are equal. Is this also reflected in the incarceration? Well, a study in the US showed that women are, on average, less likely to be incarcerated for the same crime as men are. The sentence lengths were the same, but the probation periods were longer for men also. When it comes to custody, women still have the advantage over men over who gets the custody more often. With custody, women still have the advantage due to their traditional roles as primary caregivers. There has been a buzzword out there that women only have 76% of all the rights of men have, but this is globally and not in the West. Thus, this is not qualifying for my analysis. I tried finding data on the rest, but surprisingly, the government is not really so keen on showing potentially discriminatory data. Well, men get arrested more often, but we also commit more of the crimes. I could not find any reasonably usable data. So, are women legally disadvantaged? No, the opposite is true. Women enjoy a legal advantage. Men are disadvantaged in this category because it is discriminatory and prolonged and exercised by an authority. We'll put an A for the ladies here. For the educational category, we'll analyze the performance in education and the access to education. So, do men and women have the same education access in the West? There's a distinction to be made between the US and Europe here. In the US, there's more of a barrier of entry based on income. I don't know if this is impacting the data or not, but it is important to mention. This probably affects some European countries as well, but none that I know of. All the numbers I'll be presenting now are from the World Bank, so I'll just reference this once, and the rest you can look up yourself. 100% of children has enrolled in primary school in Europe. So this is completely equal between men and women. Women are 50% of secondary education. There's also more women in higher education than men in the Netherlands. This is also true for Latin countries, and I know that they're not the point of this video, but it just shows a general trend, and I think we can extrapolate this towards the rest of the Western countries. So, access to education is the same, while there are more women in higher education than men. Is this discrimination against men? Probably not. Maybe that in classrooms the temperament of men is less tolerated, and that because of that the classrooms are just a little bit more suitable for women because of this temperament bias, but it's not discrimination according to our definition. I myself have never been discriminated against while being a man in higher education, but that's anecdotal still, so it's pretty much irrelevant, just a fun illustration. So, no disadvantages. We'll put this one at neutral with a slight advantage for you ladies. For the healthcare category, we should assess whether there's an unequal access to healthcare. It is also important to see potential discrimination in the healthcare providers. I also think that mental health should be discussed in this category. To start off, there have been found some gender differences in the need for certain treatments, but this goes both ways and it kind of offsets each other. It has to be noted that this study has been done with older individuals and may not be generalizable to younger individuals. Women make use of primary healthcare more often than men do. They also say that they're in bad health more often, yet are still more likely to survive in the next 5 years. They also generally pay more for their healthcare because they utilize it more. Thus, there is no discrimination in the access to healthcare. Healthcare providers don't really care if their customer is a male or female, since they just want to make as much money as possible. So, for the mental health issue. This one is kind of sticky because the data is just kind of all over the place. It is important to note that women are generally more neurotic, so are more likely to suffer from mental health disorders on the ends of the spectrum. Since men and women have different predispositions for different mental health issues, it is difficult to compare. We'll try it anyway, but this should not be regarded as conclusive. Men are almost twice as likely than women to take their lives globally. When we zoom in on the Western world, this becomes 3.5% more likely. When controlled for prevalence, women are about 1.6 times more likely than men to seek help for their mental health issues. While all of this is true, women are still 3 times more likely to suffer from common mental health disorders. Men also report a lower life satisfaction than women do. These are all fucked up and shocking statistics, but I can't really draw an advantage versus disadvantage conclusion from this. There's nothing exercised by authority here, so there's no disadvantage according to our definition. It is still a good wake-up call to check up on your friends, male or female. I'll put this one as neutral. For the media and communication category, we ask ourselves the question: are women misrepresented, underrepresented, or censored in the media? Well, misrepresentation I can't really speak on because this is very, very subjective. I think different people could argue different perspectives depending on the types of media you consume. Anyways, for the representation, in 2022 on all major American streaming platforms, about 50% of all protagonists were female, while 40% was male. So, more than enough representation. Is there censoring of women in the media? Well, I think since we enjoy freedom of speech and censoring is illegal, no. Although in the last few years we've been seeing more and more of the canceling of people, this is mostly the people who disagree with primarily the wokeist movement. I mention the wokeist movement because they've been the most outspoken cancelers. So, again, no disadvantages. Arguably not enough representation for men. It is arguably discriminatory and arguably done by authority, but whatever. We'll put it as neutral since this isn't a struggle competition. The next category is environmental. This means whether women are more exposed to pollution or hazardous environments. Well, men are 11 times more likely to die in a workplace incident in the US. With the workforce being about 50-50, this is, to say the least, worrying. This could be explained by men doing more dangerous jobs. For general pollution effects, there's no difference between the genders. So, is there a disadvantage against women? Most definitely not. Would I say disadvantageous against men according to our definition? Not really. These men choose their own jobs while knowing the risks, so there's no inherent disadvantage against men. We'll put this as neutral too. Now we'll cover the interpersonal and familial category. This covers domestic abuse in the emotional and physical. Some studies look at reported abuse, others at experienced abuse. This will greatly impact the outcome of the study since men tend to underreport their problems with domestic abuse. So, do women get abused more often than men? Well, in the UK, between 2021 and 2022, 1 in 4 women in the UK were a victim of domestic abuse. 1 in 6 to 7 men is also a victim of domestic abuse. In the US, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience some sort of violence by their intimate partner. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience severe forms of violence perpetrated by their intimate partner. So, it is clear that women experience more abuse than men do. As I stated earlier, this is more likely than not because men are more aggressive and more physical in their tendencies. For the emotional part, in Australia, 14% of men and 23% of women get emotionally abused in a relationship. This number fluctuates heavily per study though, since I've also seen reports that say 50% of men and women are likely to get emotionally abused during their relationships. This likely depends on the emotional abuse definition and the sample, since little differences can impact the results greatly. Especially on the male front, since it is not traditionally accepted for men to acknowledge they have been emotionally abused. This has a biological explanation, namely that men have lower emotional regulative abilities while being physically more strong and more aggressive, so this just forms a recipe for abuse. Again, still not okay, just explaining it since it's a very touchy subject for a lot of people. So, is there any discrimination here? Well, not really. Women are indeed subject of abuse more often, but it's probably not the result of discrimination. Also, there isn't much of an authority to call upon here. It is a problem, but not a disadvantage against women. So, for the last category, institutional and systemic disadvantages. This just covers the whole concept of sexism and how it could be ingrained into a system. This is also a very broad category with a lot of room for interpretation. I think a good way to measure this is to see what all the official institutions have for disadvantages against women and just weighing the average again. I know that we're almost repeating the process of the first or the last category, but this is different because we're only looking at the top-down institutes results. Since, again, through looking at the results of the top-down institutes, we can find out what the ingrained culture is. So, averaging the results of political, legal and judicial, educational, and healthcare too, since we're only looking at the EU because the US is just special with their healthcare system being mostly privatized instead of government regulated. So, that would be disadvantaged, advantaged, neutral, and neutral. This ends up being neutral. If you have a better idea of assessing this category, please tell me. I couldn't come up with one. Finally, summing up the results of every last category to finally find out what the social and cultural disadvantages or neutral or advantages are. We'll be summing all the results and finding out the outcome. So, the outcome being neutral, disadvantaged, advantaged, neutral, 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 and neutral. This comes down to a final score of, you guessed it, neutral. I hope you all learned something from this. You don't have to agree with me on the judgments, but the statistics are non-debatable unless you can show me some data that disproves what I've said. It just appears that men and women have differences, but there's no general disadvantage to being one or the other sex. I hope we can end the struggle competition of who is the most disadvantaged of the sexes and come together in these times of division. If feminism is about creating an egalitarian society, there is no need for a generalized movement anymore. Rather, a more specialized approach would be more advisable in our current society. And this would be not just for adjusting the unfairness against women. Still, there's a lot more equalizing to be done outside of the Western world. Feel free to debate me on this, or if you just want me to elaborate on stuff. And have a good day.